In 1769, Methodist founder John Wesley sent Joseph Pilmore and Richard Boardman, who were his first pair of missionary preachers, to spread the gospel on the vast American continent. The men landed in Philadelphia and began to preach the word and to organize groups of believers in the Middle Atlantic region. A number of lay preachers from England and Ireland had already immigrated to the colonies before their arrival, but they weren't sent by Wesley. Those early arrivals had already begun to lay the foundation for Methodist preaching in the New World. Long before the arrival of the Methodists, Scotch and Irish Presbyterians, German Lutherans, and Reformed people had settled the beautiful lands between the Yadkin and Catawba rivers, that part of Mecklenburg County that would become Cabarrus County in 1792. They established historic Presbyterian, Lutheran, and German Reformed churches throughout the countryside, churches that were already flourishing when the first Methodist circuit riders crossed the shallow fords over the Yadkin to fulfill John Wesley's charge to take Christ to all those in this new land. This is their story. I'm Clarence Horton. On behalf of the individuals and organizations which are dedicated to preserving the story of old Cabarrus County and her people, welcome to another important chapter in that history, the story of the coming of the people called Methodist to that portion of old Mecklenburg that became Cabarrus. It seemed appropriate to begin our account here in lovely Haywood County at Lake Junaluska Conference and Retreat Center, the heart of Methodism in western North Carolina for more than a century. Stewart Auditorium, the center's oldest and largest building, was built in 1913. It serves as home to summer conferences of the Western North Carolina Conference, the Holston Conference, and the Southeastern Jurisdiction, among other Methodist organizations and events. It provides an outstanding place for renewal and for inspiration. The story of our denomination begins with John Wesley, an ordained Anglican minister who founded the Methodist Reform movement in England in the early 18th century. Mr. Wesley always made it clear that the societies he organized were not intended to be a separate church from the Church of England. However, the American Revolution and the distinct character of the American people soon changed that expectation. Despite its English background, Methodism is often described as the most truly American denomination, organized after the Revolution to meet the needs of the pioneer families that claimed and settled the vast American frontier. The initial Methodist emphasis was on evangelism and the organization of members into small groups or classes where they could watch over one another in love. These small groups met regularly in their homes, usually without clergy being present. They formed the basis for Methodist societies or congregations. The classes and societies were the bedrock of early Methodism. By 1776, there were 65 congregations in the American colonies, a very small percentage of all colonial church members. However, the denomination grew quickly after the Treaty of Paris. Representatives from the Methodist Church were among the first religious delegations to meet with newly inaugurated President George Washington in 1789 and to assure him of their wholehearted support. Bishops Francis Asbury and Thomas Coke delivered what the New York newspaper called their affectionate and respectful address and demonstrated the church's attachment to the government of the new nation. Later, President Abraham Lincoln and Bishop Matthew Simpson were friends, and the bishop preached President Lincoln's funeral sermon in Springfield, Illinois. Although the Methodists honored John Wesley as their founder until his death in 1791, the roots of the church were sunk deep in American soil and nurtured by democratic ideals. In the New York societies, women first had leadership positions, and people of color participated in the work of the church. Unfortunately, segregation in seating at historic St. George's Church in Philadelphia led to a split in the membership and to the organization of the African Methodist Episcopal Church and later the AME Zion Church. Robert Williams was appointed to the Petersburg District in Virginia in 1774. Williams preached in North Carolina that same year and organized the first Methodist society in the state in Brunswick County on the very eve of Revolution. When armed conflict began, the work of the churches in America was disrupted, of course. John Wesley wrote a letter to American Methodists urging calm and encouraging them to remain loyal to Mother England. Partially as a result of this well-intentioned letter, the English preachers were mistrusted, and with the exception of Francis Asbury, either fled to Canada or returned to England. Methodist preachers continued to be subject to suspicion and mistreatment during the Revolution. Some Methodist ministers swore their allegiance to the colonies, but when drafted into the military service, agreed to work in non-combatant roles rather than bearing arms in violation of their consciences. Reverend Jesse Lee, for example, drove a supply wagon to fulfill his period of service. Reverend Lee was an important early Methodist leader and was very likely the first preacher at Old Bethel Methodist in Cabarrus County. Later, he became the chaplain to the U.S. House of Representatives and to the United States Senate. Even during the war years, the American preachers continued to search for believers in the wilderness. In North Carolina, the Carolina Circuit appeared in the minutes for 1776. Just before the Declaration of Independence was signed, 3 ministers were appointed to the new field. By 1778, the work had progressed so that the state was divided into 3 circuits: the Roanoke, Tar River, and New Hope. A 4th circuit, the Yadkin, was formed in 1780. At that time, there were only 680 members in all of North Carolina. A circuit was an association of the weekly classes and societies that were usually led by lay class leaders. At least once every 3 months, a traveling preacher would arrive and spend a day or 2 preaching and teaching before riding on to the next settlement. The work continued to prosper throughout the new nation. In order to provide structure and to address the continuing problem of administering the sacraments, John Wesley created a solution out of necessity. Reverend Wesley ordained Reverend Thomas Coke and dispatched him to America to supervise and organize the work, by first ordaining Francis Asbury to also serve as a superintendent, and then ordaining ministers to administer the sacraments. Later, the title of the superintendents was changed to bishop. The pressing need for ordained ministers to care for those growing American societies eventually led to the organization of the Methodist Episcopal Church at the historic Christmas Conference of 1784, held at Lovely Lane Church in Baltimore. There they organized what they styled the Methodist Episcopal Church. The Methodist work continued in North Carolina. In 1783, the Guilford Circuit was formed from the New Hope Circuit, and the Salisbury Circuit, with 30 members, was created from the Atkins Circuit. The boundaries were not very exact in those days, but the new Salisbury Circuit apparently included not only Rowan County, but that part of Surry County that later became Stokes and Forsyth, along with portions of Mecklenburg, Randolph, and Montgomery, west of the Uwharrie PD River system. In 1789, Daniel Asbury and John McGee began the work of forming the Lincoln Circuit, which included parts of Burke, Rutherford, Lincoln, and parts of Mecklenburg County, as well as some counties in South Carolina. In those early years, Methodism spread rapidly from Charleston, South Carolina, to the counties on the southern border of North Carolina. Those counties remained under the supervision of the South Carolina Conference. In 1850, the territory east of the PD River was released to the North Carolina Conference, but not until 1870 was the area west of the PD, which included Cabarrus, Stanley, and neighboring counties, released by the South Carolina Conference. It's difficult today to imagine the obstacles faced by those early circuit-riding frontier ministers. Most of them lived on fried bacon and cornbread, often eaten cold and in the saddle. They slept on dirt floors or on pine slabs, if they were fortunate enough to find a friendly hearth. Many of them met with hostility, some with outright abuse. Yet it could be said of most of them, as Bishop Cope did of Hope Hull, "Mr. Hull is young, but he is indeed a flame of fire. He appears always on the stretch for the salvation of souls." Those itinerant preachers went to a conference each year, carrying their belongings in their saddlebags, not knowing where they would be assigned for the coming year. Annual changes in ministers' appointments were normal. In 1804, a 2-year limit on the same appointment was set, but was increased to 4 years in 1866. Bishop Francis Asbury was the model for the young preachers. He believed that Methodists should take the gospel message to the pioneers, however difficult the journey. The bishop himself traveled constantly, some 6,000 miles on horseback in the average year. He became the face of the Methodist Church and was often called the prophet of the long road. Wherever the bishop traveled, he brought a sense of belonging to the lonely pioneers in the wilderness. His arrival also meant an interruption in the unending toil of farm work in the backcountry. Special meals were prepared. There was memorable preaching and the administration of the sacraments. Children were baptized and communion served. Those early Methodist ministers did not wait for people to build a church and call them. They went where the people were and inspired them to build churches. During his long career from 1771 to 1816, Bishop Asbury traveled at least 228,000 miles on horseback, even more than John Wesley, and died on his way to the 1816 conference in Baltimore. From the available records, it appears that those early circuit riders first organized the work in that part of Old Mecklenburg that became Cabarrus County in the early 1780s, here at historic Bethel Church in Number 10 Township. A fragment of an early membership roll indicates that Margaret McClellan joined the church at Bethel in 1783 and was joined the following year by other families, some with Presbyterian ties, such as the McClartys. The first deed for the church property was dated in October 1808. Until that time, it is believed that the congregation worshiped in a log cabin near the present site of Bethel Church. Land was obtained, and the first small building was replaced by a log sanctuary in 1810, then by a frame sanctuary in about 1835. In 1923, a brick sanctuary was erected for Bethel Church. Many of those early Bethel members were likely brought into the church in 1802, when a great revival spread throughout the area between the Yadkin and Catawba rivers. It appears the Presbyterians actually began the movement, but the Methodists carried it to its fruition. Methodist orators reached throughout the Yadkin Valley, attracting entire pioneer families who journeyed as far as 100 miles to share in the camp meeting experience. Bethel was among the early locations that hosted those meetings, and its experience was probably typical. Originally, families camped out for 4 or 5 days in makeshift tents. In J.L. Trollinger's history of the Bethel Church, he notes that many of those early families built small log cabins for the annual meetings. The cabins had a sleeping area in the back and a cooking area in the front, and were built far enough apart to allow teams and wagons to pass between those shelters. Later, Clara Bryant wrote that the people came from near and far with their families, their friends, their servants, their stoves and their foodstuffs, their cows and coops of chickens, to tent on Bethel's old campground. 4 times a day they were called to worship by the blowing of a trumpet, at 8 and 11 in the morning, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and at 8 o'clock in the evening. Later, Bethel members erected a permanent outdoor shelter to be used for music and preaching during the popular meetings, which not only provided great spiritual refreshment, but were important events in the social life of the people. The camp meeting experience continued until near the end of the 19th century. In 1878, a reporter for the Carolina Watchman newspaper in Salisbury wrote a description of a camp meeting he attended at Old Bethel that year. There are some 32 cabins, he wrote, all of which were occupied. The place has been used as a campground for half a century. With new cabins going up from time to time, it indicates that it's likely to be a campground for a long time to come. It was estimated that 2,000 people were present there last Sunday. The open air harbor, which was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1997, was erected in the 1830s, replacing a brush arbor, which was a shelter with tree branches forming a roof, much like a thatched roof. The historic arbor has a tin roof and is supported by hand-hewn oak timbers, joined together by wooden pegs. Although there's no longer tenting on the old campgrounds at Bethel, the congregation continues to celebrate its homecoming Sunday each year on the 2nd Sunday in August with a service held in the historic arbor. The Bethel congregation has continued to grow and serves as a vibrant witness in and to its community. Its active programs have resulted in construction of 2 fellowship buildings. The old building, now called the Taylor Youth Building, was completed in 1958. As the church grew, however, a new fellowship building was needed. The new building, Asbury Hall, was dedicated in 1999. An educational building was dedicated on Homecoming Sunday in 1987. Work on a new sanctuary began in 2006 and was completed in time for Christmas in 2007. The camp meeting movement fired Methodist congregations with the spirit of revival. New churches were started, old ones strengthened. When the Sugar Creek Circuit was formed in 1815, from territory in the South Carolina Conference, the new circuit included portions of Anson, Mecklenburg, and Cabarrus counties, as well as several churches in Iredell and Rowan counties. According to Methodist historian Elmer Clark,
Bethel Methodist was then one of the oldest preaching points in Cabarrus County, together with Rogers Meeting House, which is now Mount Olivet, and Mount Moriah, which is now part of Center Grove Methodist. At that time, the Sugar Creek Circuit was a part of the Catawba District of the South Carolina Conference. Asbury Methodist in eastern Cabarrus, founded by Martin Widenhouse, is traditionally regarded as older than its sister congregation of Mount Moriah, although documentary evidence is lacking and Asbury is not listed in the initial Sugar Creek minutes. Tucker's was then a meeting house in eastern Cabarrus, south of Rocky River, and was included in the surviving Rocky River Circuit minutes for the years 1810 through 1819. Tucker's was listed as a preaching point in the Sugar Creek Circuit minutes from 1823 through 1833, but we know very little of its history thereafter. There are no surviving buildings, but the Tucker Family Cemetery is located on the south side of Rocky River, across the river from the Boss Grist Mill and St. Paul's United Methodist Church. The revivals and the camp meeting movement led to the formation of a congregation at this location on the shores of Rocky River, at least by 1855. In 1856, the Bost family generously donated land for the first St. Paul's sanctuary and cemetery. The survey of that first tract, a little more than 4 acres, showed the location of the church land in a thriving community centered around the grist mill, post office, store, and blacksmith shop located on the Concord Road, the present Highway 200. That first church building was constructed of logs located near the old cemetery and along an old mill road, some distance off the main wagon road to Concord and Sherrall. The building was a plain structure without ornamentation as required by the Methodist discipline. There was no air conditioning, so that the windows and doors were open for ventilation in the heat of the summer. During the winter months, a wood stove in the center of the sanctuary provided heat. The 2 acres of land on which this present church is located was donated by Martin Luther Bost and his wife Rosetta in consideration of the payment of $1. Later in 1910, the St. Paul trustees returned 3 acres of the original 1856 tract on which the log church had been built to Mr. E.T. Bost, retaining the acre or so on which the church cemetery is located. Attorney and local historian John Sharp Hartzell described the appearance of the new sanctuary. It had 2 front doors, he said, with 3 rows of pews. It was not unusual for the women to sit on one side and the men on the other. A solid walnut pulpit and furnishings were built for the new church by Jim Harkey. Meetings in the new sanctuary were joyous. The people loved music, but St. Paul's, like her sister church at Center Grove, had no piano or organ at that time. Singing was led by Robert Hartzell at St. Paul's and Milas Coley at Center Grove, with the aid of pitch pipes or tuning forks, which they carried with them. There were very few hymn books at first, and the hymns were lined out, several lines at a time, by the pastor or by a lay leader. That new church was an important part of the Bost Mill community. The mill site became a favorite recreational destination for young people who were willing to endure the long wagon ride from Concord, which began at daybreak, to spend a few hours picnicking, playing games, and maybe courting a little on the pasture along the edge of the river. Accounts survive to this day of great fishing from the mill dam, rowboat cruises on the river, baseball games, as well as the well-filled baskets of cold chicken and homemade desserts.
Worn out from the long day and the long ride, they sang or slept on the long ride home. Picnics were held at the old Boss Mill in the summer. There were annual July 4th celebrations with baseball games in the mill pasture between teams from townships 9 and 10. Much has changed, but this beloved church building has survived, although it was remodeled in the early 1950s. The original 2 front doors were replaced by one centrally located entrance, and a rear door was added.
In September 1867, Paul Furr and his wife Eve deeded a tract of 4 acres for a new church building to church trustees Martin Widenhouse, W.M. Widenhouse, Jesse Cox, Wiley Biggers, and Daniel Furr. It provided a location for a new church building to house the merged congregations of Mount Moriah Methodist and Asbury Methodist. Those 2 historic churches had agreed to unite and take the name Center Grove Methodist. The land which had been occupied by the Asbury Sanctuary was returned to the Widenhouse family, who had originally donated it, and the Mount Moriah church grounds were sold to Jesse Cox for a consideration of $20. The histories and traditions of Mount Moriah and Asbury Methodist did not end with that merger, but were continued by the newly formed congregation. According to the earliest Center Grove Methodist account, a log church was built on its 4-acre tract. With some substantial improvements over the years, the old church served the Center Grove congregation for half a century. The eastern Cabarrus area had had a long tradition of camp meetings and revivals, many of which had been held at the large campground at Bethel Methodist. In 1879, Center Grove built a new campground and carried on the same traditions. Gradually, however, as the century came to an end, camp meetings were replaced by well-attended revival meetings, which were held inside the church sanctuary. Other annual observances at Center Grove that were always highly anticipated were the Mother's Day services, the quarterly meetings of the Mount Pleasant Circuit, which were often held here at Center Grove, and the Children's Day exercises. The Wesley Bible class was very active and often planned church-wide picnics at such local beauty spots as Hagler's Ford. Center Grove also enjoyed a close relationship with nearby Georgeville Academy, attended and sometimes participated in the Academy's programs. In 1920, the Center Grove congregation began construction of a new church building, the Sunday school rooms. Young Jackson Klutz had the honor of cutting down the first tree as the members of the congregation brought their teams to the site to haul the logs that would furnish the timbers for the new frame building. As always, the women of the church were deeply involved in fundraising projects for the new sanctuary. Reverend W.T. Albright preached in the new building on Sunday, December 18, 1921, and Reverend Zebulon Teeter scheduled a service on Christmas Day at 1 o'clock. Despite the shortage of some building materials due to the Second World War, the current sanctuary was completed and dedicated to the Lord's service on September 30, 1945, by Bishop Clare Purcell of Charlotte. For most of its history, Center Grove was a part of the Mount Pleasant Circuit of the Salisbury District, together with congregations in Mount Pleasant, Cold Springs, and St. Paul's. In a leap of faith in the mid-1950s, however, the congregation built a modern brick parsonage and became a station appointment with a full-time minister in October 1956. 1974 was a red letter year in in Center Grove history, for the Western North Carolina Conference acted to take the church from the Center Grove Friendship Charge, which left Friendship as a station church, and join it to nearby St. Paul's to form the Center Grove St. Paul's Charge, a relationship that continues to serve and to endure. Rogers Meeting House, now known as Mount Olivet United Methodist Church, is the second oldest surviving Methodist church in Cabarrus County, after Old Bethel. However, early circuit writers on the Salisbury Circuit also mention other early Cabarrus preaching places, such as Hearn's Meeting House, in their journals. Old deeds confirm that Elisha, William, and Jesse Hearn owned land near the Wagon Road in eastern Cabarrus County, running from Salisbury to Anson County. But the exact location of that early meeting house is unknown, and no church structures remain. The Hearn family removed to Stanley County and remained strong supporters of Methodism there, as well as supplying the first sheriff for that county. Although services in the area were likely held much earlier, 1803 is regarded as the founding date for Rogers Meeting House. In that year, property was purchased by John Rogers, of which 2 acres was used for the meeting house that became Mount Olivet. The church still occupies its original location on the ridge overlooking 3 Mile Branch, adjoining present-day Cabarrus Memorial Park. John Rogers, who became a successful Concord merchant, is buried in the old cemetery at Mount Olivet near his sister Susanna Rogers Glover. Early church histories state that John Rogers was the son of George and Martha Rogers, who were also buried in the Rogers section of the cemetery. The family moved to Cabarrus County from Bedford County, Virginia. During his lifetime, John Rogers was active in the life of the early Methodist Church in the area, serving as conference steward for many years. By settled tradition, the first congregation worshiped in the Rogers home, which was located near the present site of the cemetery. In clear weather, services were held outdoors, under the sheltering oaks and in arbors. The congregation grew to the point that the church members built a sanctuary of logs that members cut off the land. That early meeting house was named Rogers Meeting House in honor of the founding family, which had donated land and supported the construction. The building was adequate to house the quarterly church conferences, which were often held in Rogers Meeting House. A Sunday school was organized there in 1834. The first frame sanctuary was constructed in about 1870, and the name of the church changed to Mount Olivet Methodist. From the end of the Reconstruction period through 1937, Mount Olivet was usually a part of the Concord Circuit, composed of Methodist churches in Cabarrus County, and was a part of the Salisbury District. It was grouped with Rocky Ridge Methodist, and often with Union, Center, and Mount Carmel churches. Mount Olivet was blessed with strong lay leadership, and the church continued to prosper. By 1914, the frame sanctuary was no longer adequate for its growing congregation. The active Sunday school and youth programs, as well as the many programs sponsored by men and women of the church. A modern brick structure with the typical Methodist tower and 2 front doors was completed in 1915 to house the worship services and Sunday school classes. To meet the needs of the growing church, the structure was renovated and enlarged several times. By 1937, the growing congregation felt it could support a full-time minister, and it became a station church, erecting a parsonage for Reverend J.N. Randall and his family, a recreational building for the benefit of the youth in the community, and to house the growing scouting program, was substantially completed in 1946, with much of the work done by members of the church. The building was dedicated in honor of the 60 men and women from the Mount Olivet family who served their country during World War II. In 1965, a modern education building was constructed to meet the need for additional Sunday school classrooms and for the church offices. In the mid-1970s, the congregation began to plan for a new memorial hall, which would provide space for meetings, receptions, and church suppers. The new building was completed in 1976, and the adjoining recreation building became home to the active scout troop and the youth program. Highlighting more than a century of mission support is the church's continuing relationship with the Methodists in Kenya. That relationship began in 1977 with an exchange of pulpits between Reverend Louis Gibbs and Reverend Meshach Kanaki of Mawa, Kenya. Every 3 years, volunteers from Mount Olivet travel to Kenya to work on projects there, to continue the church's association with the Kanaki family, and to renew other friendships formed on mission trips over the years. Education has always been a strong interest for the Mount Olivet congregation, and the church continues to actively support the work of nearby Wynkoff School. The quality of the church choirs and its music programs, together with the church's ties to the choral group known as the Piedmont Singing Men, join with the popular Heavenly Hot Dog Fridays, Bible study, and mission programs to ensure that the church's witness to the surrounding community has not lessened after more than 200 years of faithful service. In 1834, the growing Sugar Creek Circuit became the Charlotte Circuit. That large circuit was reduced in size, and Rogers Meeting House was transferred to the Center Circuit in the Cheraw District. Center Circuit's territory extended from the PD and Yadkin Rivers in the east to Coldwater Creek in the west. Under the leadership of Reverend David Derrick, its first assigned preacher, the Center Circuit added 161 members in 1833. Reverend Derrick was one of the pivotal figures in Cabarrus County Methodism. Born in the Dutch Fork section of South Carolina in 1800, he could preach effectively in the German tongue. When he died in 1883, he was deeply mourned and was remembered as a sympathetic and earnest pastor with a voice of wonderful power and sweetness. He was again appointed to Center Circuit in 1834, adding another 111 members to church rolls. At that time, church rules only allowed 2 consecutive one-year appointments to a circuit. But in 1837, Derrick was returned to the Center Circuit to serve along with Reverend Abel Hoyle. Reverend Derrick's return to the Concord area allowed him to complete some of the work he had begun there during his earlier appointment. He gave thanks for the success of the work, noting in his diary that almost 200 persons were added to local church rolls, and 230 more were admitted on trial. Incredibly, he records that 6 new churches were built and dedicated on the circuit. Reverend Derrick held preaching services in the Cabarrus County Courthouse in Concord in 1833 with some success. In 1834, Concord was included as a preaching point on the circuit. The work continued during his absence, and a Concord church was organized by Reverend P.G. Bowman in 1836 with 7 members. In 1837, Derrick and Abel Hoyle obtained a lot on Church Street for the new church, despite the opposition of some residents who complained that the Methodists were loud and enthusiastic in their style of worship. From the early history of the church by Mrs. Janie Patterson Wagner, we have a description of that first sanctuary.
She writes that the frame building was located between the cotton platform and a building on the corner of what was then East Depot Street. The building was white, some 60 feet by 36 feet in width, and had two front doors opening on the street. The interior was divided by a partition some 4 or 5 feet high, dividing the men on the left side from the women on the right side. The rear portion of the sanctuary was reserved for the African American members of the congregation. The building was heated by a high box-shaped wood-burning stove, and there were foot stoves for use in severe winter weather. The pulpit was elevated in the style of those days. As required by the Methodist discipline, the building was generally plain and unadorned. In 1838, Reverend Bowman was reassigned to the circuit. The Concord Church was completed and a revival meeting held that brought 70 members into Concord Methodist Church, later Central ME Church South. As a further result of those revival meetings, a camp meeting site was built just outside the city limits of Concord, near the small cotton factory on today's Buffalo Street and the camp meeting spring. The Concord camp meeting was so highly anticipated that in 1843 the board of directors of the Concord Cotton Factory ordered that the manager should stop the factory from Thursday until Monday during the approaching camp meeting so that the mill employees could attend the meetings which were held near today's Boys and Girls Club. Concord Methodist continued to grow. In 1845, the congregation secured a lot on Church Street on which a parsonage was erected. By the late 1850s, a new sanctuary was being planned, and property on North Union Street purchased for building purposes. The large wooded lot on the east side of North Union, which is the present location of Central United Methodist Church, was the original location desired by Reverend Derrick 20 years earlier. Work on the new sanctuary began in earnest in 1860, but the outbreak of the war delayed completion until 1868. The new building was paid for in part from sales of 2 small tracts cut off the large church campus. The South Carolina Conference was then engaged in transferring the churches under its jurisdiction to North Carolina, and by 1870, Concord Methodist Episcopal Church South was a station church in the North Carolina Conference. A 2-story brick parsonage was built on the south side of the sanctuary and served the congregation until 1937. The parsonage was demolished in 1959 to make room for a beautiful educational building completed in 1960. In 1891, the congregation changed its name to Central ME Church South. Central celebrated its centennial in 1939 and again changed its name, becoming Central Methodist Church and celebrating the reunification of several main divisions of the Methodist Church. In 1968, the church name was again changed to Central United Methodist Church in recognition of the merger of the Methodist Church and the Evangelical United Brethren Church. Although the old sanctuary had been extensively remodeled, it no longer served the needs of the active congregation. In 1968, a building committee was formed to plan for a new sanctuary, and the last meeting in the historic old church was held in 1972. In 1974, Reverend Harold Wright preached at the consecration service in the new sanctuary. During the dramatic expansion of the 1970s, parsonages for both the senior pastor and the associate pastor were purchased in Concord.
Despite the substantial debt incurred by the congregation, through faithful stewardship, the building debt was paid in December 1980, and a memorable dedication service held in April 1981. The sanctuary and its building were extensively renovated in 2016, and the church added a great new organ. From its beginning, the Central Methodist congregation was active in missions, both worldwide and local. A substantial portion of the funds raised for missions are contributed to local groups, such as Cooperative Christian Ministry, Salvation Army, and Hospice. Local emphases include fighting hunger among both children and older adults through programs such as Meals on Wheels and Backpack Buddies. Each year, Central participates in the annual crop walk to combat hunger. The United Methodist men and United Methodist women are active in these areas and countless others. There are ministries for older adults, including health ministries guided by a parish nurse. Sunday school classes for all ages from nursery up are available, with a well-organized vacation Bible school each summer. There are fellowship meals throughout the year, as well as prayer meetings and Bible studies. In 2013, long-serving retired Central Minister Andy Langford published an excellent history of Central Methodist, which also serves as an introduction to the history of the Methodist movement. At the end of his account, the beloved Central Minister prophetically states that the history of Central has not been completed. New ideas, new opportunities, new people, new pastors, new missions will continue to arise. Our future is as bright as our past. According to traditional accounts, Rocky Ridge Methodist was formed in 1842, its organization growing out of the revivals and camp meetings held in Concord by Reverends Derrick and Bowman. A group of Methodists and Presbyterians built a frame building on the property of A.Q. White for use as a union church where both denominations might worship. After sharing the church building for some time, the Presbyterians built their own church nearby, while the Methodists remained on the original rocky site. They purchased a little more than a quarter acre from A.Q. White for the sum of $5 in August of 1859. That was not unusual in those simpler times. The church did not rush to record its deed to the land, but eventually did so in 1924, when the sanctuary was rebuilt after being lost to fire. During much of its early life, Rocky Ridge was on the Concord circuit with a number of other churches. By 1890, when the Western North Carolina Conference of the ME Church South was formed, Reverend Thomas Smith was tending a circuit that then included Mount Carmel, Mount Olivet, and Boger's Chapel, together with Rocky Ridge. According to the accounts of older members, the original Rocky Ridge Sanctuary was paneled with beaded ceiling and was lighted by 4 kerosene lamps. As was customary in those days, the altar, pews, and other furnishings were made by local carpenters. The first sanctuary was built on brick columns with no underpinning, but it served the congregation until destroyed by fire in the early 1920s. The present beloved brick sanctuary is almost a century old, has been renovated several times, but still meets the needs of the active congregation with the aid of several major additions. On the south side of the sanctuary, a building joined by a walkway houses offices and space for a Christian preschool. After years of fundraising and generous contributions, Rocky Ridge erected a beautiful multi-purpose building, the Family Life Center, to the north of the sanctuary. The congregation is now engaged in a 3-year capital campaign called Climb the Rock to Financial Freedom, intended to retire the debt on the building and to enable an increase in church involvement with other mission programs. That effort has been very successful, with the church tithing 10% of contributions to local missions, including Bible teaching classes at 5 area high schools, crisis ministry relief, and hurricane relief. The Family Life Center itself is suitable for indoor sports such as basketball, for meetings and holiday programs, as well as a kitchen and dining space for the popular Friday hot dog lunches and meals associated with weddings and with funerals. Mission outreach is a continuing emphasis for the folks at Rocky Ridge. Active Sunday school classes contribute their helping hands at points of needs throughout the community. For years, the church has engaged in a ministry for the homeless called the Green Shoe Ministry. Volunteers meet at the church on Mondays and prepare bag lunches for homeless people in the Concord area, as well as distributing contributed bus tickets to people in need of transportation. The church has very active organizations of United Methodist men and United Methodist women, special musical groups for children, and has a mission relationship with churches in Honduras and a Wednesday evening Bible study. Through its continuing and traditional emphasis on missions, both locally and globally, the friendly folks at Rocky Ridge continue to try to carry out John Wesley's admonition that they translate the love and witness for Jesus Christ into action all around the world. Bethpage Methodist on West C Street in Kannapolis is located on the west side of Kannapolis, on the Rowan side of the county line, but has always enjoyed a close relationship with the Methodist churches located in Kannapolis and Cabarrus County. Church has an interesting history. A visitor will be drawn to the old cemetery on the church property, the dates on the old gravestones indicating they are much older than the date a Methodist congregation began worshiping on that property. The site was originally the home of historic Bethpage Presbyterian Church, which now worships on its beautiful campus along the Mooresville Road. When Bethpage Presbyterian voted to move its location to the new site in about 1841, a Methodist church named Rehoboth was able to purchase the old church property from the Presbyterians. According to traditional accounts, the Rehoboth congregation decided to retain the Bethpage name associated with that property, and it became Bethpage Methodist. Reverend Derrick's ministry bore further fruit. When he was assigned to the Center Circuit in 1834, he preached in Mount Pleasant against the advice of his friends and supporters. He did, however, have the encouragement of General Paul Barringer, a prominent Lutheran. Barringer himself was converted at the meetings held by Derrick. According to traditional accounts, small Methodist congregation began to meet in the village as a result of Reverend Derrick's efforts. In 1847, a little more than an acre of land for a Methodist church in Mount Pleasant was purchased from Jacob Ludwig for about $8. A Methodist church was formally organized in 1848, and a small wooden structure built on the Ludwig property. According to early church records, 2 more frame structures followed. A brick building to house the sanctuary was erected around the turn of the 20th century. Bricks for that 4th building were made from native clay at the old Tucker Brickyard. As the congregation grew, the brick building became inadequate for its needs. In 1941, during the ministry of Reverend H.L. Creech, a building committee began to plan for a new church building. Although construction was delayed by the war and by the shortage of building materials, the new building was completed in 1949 and dedicated in 1953, with Bishop Harrell presiding. For a time, Mount Pleasant Methodist was on a charge of 5 churches, together with Center Grove, St. Paul, Cold Springs, and Friendship. In 1960, the church became a station church, erecting a new parsonage for their minister. The lovely old sanctuary continues to command a view of the village from its hilltop in the center of town, directly across the road from the historic church cemetery. It is no longer alone on its spacious campus, however. A brick fellowship building with a spacious meeting area and commercial-sized kitchen meets the needs of groups meeting at the church. A large playground area was completed and dedicated to the memory of beloved member Violet Huff. The jewel in the Mount Pleasant Methodist crown is the Lighthouse Worship Center, a multi-purpose, multi-story structure adjoining the fellowship building. Completed in 2010, the Lighthouse Worship Center is the site of the 11 o'clock Sunday morning worship service, a contemporary service blending old and new Christian music and featuring drums and guitars. A traditional service with music by a choir, accompanied by piano and organ, starts the Sunday worship experience at 8:30 in the morning, followed by Sunday school at 9:45. The carpeted worship center can accommodate an audience of about 350 persons, has a stage with space for speakers, singers, and a band, modern lighting, a sound system, and large screens. The many uses for the center illustrate the number and range of local mission programs in which the congregation participates. The center has hosted town hall meetings and healthcare seminars, as well as the community Thanksgiving meal. Families and other groups hosting meals, blood drives, and packaging events as part of efforts to combat hunger. An AA group meets in the parlor. Children's programs are frequently scheduled for the center. They include an indoor glow-in-the-dark Easter egg hunt, children's plays, youth basketball nights, a Pee-wee soccer clinic, Nerf wars, birthday parties, movie nights, pageants, vacation Bible school, and a successful after-school program in the downstairs youth rooms. There are exercise and fitness programs for all ages, beginning with the senior exercise program, weekly pickleball competitions, and the Run for God program. With easy access to the kitchen facilities of the adjacent fellowship building, events such as the band banquets, football team meals, wedding receptions, and funeral visitations, and the United Methodist Men's Annual Steak Dinner make full use of the facility. From the hilltop location of its traditional sanctuary to the versatile worship center, Mount Pleasant United Methodist demonstrates through its mission emphases and the variety of its worship experiences its desire to reflect its faithful witness into all the corners of individual needs, to carry out John Wesley's admonition to do all the good that we can.
In addition to the popular camp meeting facilities at Bethel Methodist in Township 10, another early, well-established camp meeting site was located on the old Fayetteville Road, much used for travel between Concord and points in Stanley and Montgomery counties. Travelers often stopped for the night at a point near a clear, cold spring that gave the name to its location. According to church history, people began gathering for camp meetings at the Cold Springs location about 1830 to 1840, and later formally organized the Cold Springs Camp Meeting, associated with the Methodist Church. They were able to purchase 52 acres of land for $619.50 in 1860. But the outbreak of war the following year prevented completion of a church building until about 1868. when the first Cold Springs ME Church South sanctuary was erected. That first church was a plain, one-room frame building with a shingled gable roof underpinned with rock pillars. The church was then part of the South Carolina Conference, but along with other area churches was transferred to the North Carolina Conference at the end of 1869. Cold Springs Church quickly became a vital force in the surrounding community and continues to be so today. When the original frame building no longer met the needs of the congregation, it was torn down and replaced by a lovely red brick structure with a balcony, which combined Gothic revival and Victorian details. The congregation was generous with financial gifts that made the new church possible, as well as donations of their time and talents in the actual construction. Together with additions to house the large Sunday school classes, the old church served the needs of the congregation for 80 years. A parsonage was built in 1954 and a fellowship hall a few years later. The active congregation now worships at its third sanctuary, which was completed in 1991. Creminger Hall, a new spacious fellowship building, was completed in 2009 and connected to the church by a covered walkway. The old fellowship building was renovated to provide space for new staff offices and a meeting room for the youth. A beautifully landscaped church cemetery across the road from the church is the result of gifts from John and Hixie Lawson and from Manuel Kaiser. The steeple from the 1911 church was moved to the church cemetery as a prayer steeple. The doors, windows, and rails inside the prayer steeple also came from the old 1911 church. The cemetery committee erected a beautiful brick marker in 1990 displaying the name of the cemetery.
A contemporary worship service is held in the sanctuary at 8:45 a.m. on Sunday mornings, together with We Worship, a service for children 2 to 6 years of age, held at the same time. Sunday school for all ages follows at 10 a.m., and then a traditional 11 o'clock service is held. Cold Springs is well known as the site of an annual barbecue Brunswick stew sale held in every October. Longtime members enjoy pointing out that multiple generations of their families have enjoyed serving barbecue, their special Brunswick stew and homemade desserts, to area residents since 1954. During the growing season, the church also holds a farmer's market on the first Saturday of each month. Attendees are invited to join their friends and neighbors at the monthly community breakfast prepared in Creminger Hall, the present fellowship building, which was completed in 2009. In addition to the community breakfast, active United Methodist men and women's groups plan and support fundraisers such as bake sales to support the youth programs, the Mount Pleasant Food Ministry, and assembling bags of necessary items for the homeless. The hearts of the caring congregation are always open to the victims of natural disasters and those in need. 10% of the profit from their annual barbecue sale is contributed to the church's Needy Fund. The church also faithfully supports the annual Samaritan's Purse, Operation Christmas Child initiative. The future of their children is vitally important to this congregation. From a preschool for the children 1 to 5 years old to activities for teens, the church makes wholesome activities available to its youth. Kids Connection, a Bible study for children, is held on Sunday nights during the school year for those in K to 5th grade. At the same time, young people in grades 6 through 12 attend meetings of the United Methodist Youth Fellowship in the youth room. Cold Springs actively supports a Cub Scout program, and for more than half a century has supported Boy and Girl Scout organizations. An organized trunk or treat activity makes Halloween special at Cold Springs. An enclosed children's playground dedicated in 2004 is located behind the church and is dedicated to all teachers of children. In addition to volunteering for the multitude of activities already mentioned, there are special activities for adults, including a strong prayer ministry and Bible studies. A dedicated group of members work hard on improvements to the church's namesake spring that has supplied water to passing travelers and worshipers for generations. The United Methodist men completely renovated the original spring in 1977 using rocks from the Barnhart family farm. In 1996, the Cold Springs United Methodist men built a sheltered area for picnics beside the spring and dedicated it to John Kimray. The following year, access to the area was improved with the construction of steps leading to the spring. In 2009, the road leading to the spring was paved. The church monthly newsletter is appropriately named The Fountain in honor of that historic spring. Longtime Cold Springs members describe the spring as their tie to the past and their historical treasure, noting that many of their members were baptized there. They poetically call it a place where stories live on, a place where footprints have been left behind by our saints, a window into a simpler time. Under the faithful stewardship of the Cold Springs congregation, may it continue to be so for generations to come. In 1856, severe weather prevented Reverend Jacob L. Shuford from keeping all of his appointments on the Concord Circuit. Reverend Shuford ran a notice in the Concord Gazette on February 12, setting out his schedule and confirming there were at least 10 preaching places on the circuit he was serving. Of them, Rogers Meeting House, or Mount Olivet, Concord, now Central, Rocky Ridge, Mount Pleasant, and St. Paul's are still active. Union Church merged with St. Matthew's in 1888 to form Mount Carmel Methodist, which closed its doors at the end of 2018. In 1867, Mount Moriah and Asbury united to form Center Grove Methodist on Highway 200 near the Stanley County line. Efforts to obtain information on Emory and Smith Schoolhouse continue. Hearns and Tucker's meeting houses of the pioneer days passed into history with scarcely a trace. But their spiritual legacy is still deeply felt in eastern Cabarrus County with its strong Methodist roots.
Thank you for having been with us as we turned some of the yellowed pages of preachers' journals and conference records. Much of our early history and that of our neighbors is found in old church records and in our historic cemeteries. We hope that you will be with us as we continue to record more of the story of this special place, this Cabarrus. We hope to see you again real soon.